Good afternoon. And all for today, the Committee on General Government Operation, Appropriation, and Housing is now called to order. For the record, today is Thursday, July 15, 2021, and the time now is 2:01. Notice for this budget hearing was disseminated via email to all senators and all main media broadcasting outlets. First public notice was issued on July 6th, followed by July 8th and July 12th. The committee will hear and accept testimony on Bill 55-36 COR, the fiscal year 2022 Appropriation Act as requested by the Governor, relative to the Guam Department of Education fiscal year 2022 budget request. I'd like to acknowledge the senators that have joined me this afternoon. I have my Vice Chair, Senator Amanda Shelton, and I know we do have the Oversight Chair, Senator Talina Nelson, that will be in about a minute. General rules for this budget hearing. Those testifying on behalf of Bill 55-36 COR relative to the Guam Department of Education have been invited, and the panel are specifically Mr. John Fernandez, the Superintendent, and the Chairman of the Board of Education, Mr. Mark Mendiola. Mr. Fernandez or Mr. Mendiola, you can introduce your staff when the time comes, but not in the beginning. Just when you need, before they speak, I just ask the staff that before you speak, I just need you to identify yourself one time, and you won't need to do it the rest of the time you're speaking, okay? Written testimony shall be submitted to the committee. Please provide my legislative staff with written testimony for photocopying. Testimony may be read, and a lengthy testimony should be summarized to about 5 minutes. But Mr. Fernandez, Mr. Mendiola, you have more than 5 minutes to speak, okay? Basically, we have the afternoon. Hopefully, we won't have to use it all, okay? Those testifying will be allowed to present oral testimony. Once you're done, please remain in the room for questioning, as may be desired by members of the committee. Questions and testimony shall be confined to the substance or nature of the agenda. We're here to talk about the Department of Education's budget. Nothing more, and preferably nothing less. Personal inference as to the character or the motive of any senator or any individual testifying is not permitted. Any violation of this general rule of conduct will result in removal from the budget hearing room. Proper form and decorum shall be practiced by all present in the public hearing room for the proceedings. Individuals who fail to maintain proper form and decorum may be restricted from providing oral testimony and or may be asked to leave the room. If you violate the proper form and decorum, you will be removed from the room. When you speak, please make sure that the microphone is on and that you speak into the microphone. Please state your name and your title for the record. I will now ask the Sergeant at Arms to ask the panel to please rise while you're being sworn in.
Please raise your right hand. Under penalty of perjury, do you all affirm that any and all information that you provide today, whether it be verbally, electronically, and in writing, be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Mr. Chair, you're under oath. You may proceed.
Thank you, Sergeant at Arms. And I'd like to also recognize that we're also joined by Senator Sabina Perez. Coincidentally, for the Department of Education, you have 2 former teachers. I say former because they're senators today, okay? With that, I'd ask Mr. Fernandez. I see you've got at least 50 pages on your slides, but I have no problem with it. We're good. You may begin your presentation, sir, on your budget. Or you can ask your chairman to give his opening, but whoever's going to present it, feel free to start.
All
okay,
right.
Sir.
Hafidi, Honorable Senators, Mark Mendiola, Chairman of the Guam Education Board and also Chair of the Budget and Finance Committee. I just want to take the opportunity at the time just to thank our good Senator, the Chair of the Budget and Ways and Means Committee for allowing us and affording us the opportunity. I know we've met before to discuss some of the changes. We submitted our budget based on the law on January 31st, and we were able to work with your office to give us a little bit more time and took the advice from your office and from you to look at the funds that have been coming in from the federal side, our federal partners. In addition to that, I want to thank our Oversight Chair, Senator Talina Nelson, for being very open to meeting with us and discussing with us some areas that we highlighted in the budget. I honestly believe that this is the presentation today here is A lot of work has went into this, and with the active communication with the respective offices has given us an opportunity to come back to you folks to let you guys know that we'll continue to drive forward in our mission. The board stands behind the superintendent's presentation, and we are eager and ready to open for the new school year. And so I just want to publicly thank the superintendent and his team. This is no easy feat. We've gone through this pandemic together, and we're coming out of this, hopefully, with the resources that's necessary to safely open our schools. So thank you, and I'll yield the rest of my time to our good superintendent here. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fernandez?
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Nelson, Senator Shelton, Senator Perez. We're glad to be here today to testify on the FY22 budget request. Before I do, let me go ahead and introduce, on my far right, we have Acting Deputy Superintendent for Finance and Administrative Services, Mr. Frank Cooper-Nurse. To my left, we have Mr. Ike Santos, our Federal Programs Administrator. And then to our further left, at the end of the table, is Deputy Superintendent Joe Sanchez for Curriculum and Instruction, but also actually really taking the lead in a lot of the federal funded projects that we're also undertaking this year. So again, thank you. I want to thank your staff because they've been very helpful as we've been trying to prepare for a budget hearing that really is not our typical, usual type of budget year, because where we started in January to where we are today, we really want to be clear to the legislature as to what's happened in terms of our needs, in terms of the support that we're getting locally and federally, and what that means for the year ahead. So thank you for working with us, because it's not maybe an easy picture to understand, but we will try to do our best in sharing where we are and what our needs are for the coming year. Thank you also for allowing us to, I think actually requiring the PowerPoint presentation. As you said, because DOE is the largest agency, we went over the 10 slide requirement. We have a few more slides, but we won't spend as much time. We just wanted to make sure it was a thorough picture. So thank you, and we can go ahead and, are the slides going to be up on the, okay. We can go ahead. So again, thank you. This is our FY22 budget request. Today I'm going to be talking about both what we submitted, and then in June, we also submitted a revised request. So through the course of this presentation, I may reference the original request as well as the amended request, so we can be clear on what we're asking for the coming year. Next slide, please. I do this every year because just important for us to think about and to understand our appropriations and our budget environment. And unfortunately, when we look back over the past 5 years, it's been a challenge for not just for DOE, but for the entire island, because if you look back to FY17 and FY18, that's kind of the time frame where the federal tax cuts hit, and we've been actually trying to recover from that situation. And I think as we were turning the corner, then COVID-19 came on top of that. So what it shows you is, from the appropriations, from a budgetary standpoint, the Guam Education Board, in following the mandates, the 14-point mandates, in the law, and in following the statutory process for how we go out to our schools and start at the school level to really put together our budget requests, what you see since FY17 to today is a growing list of needs that has accumulated from year to year. So this January, our FY2022 budget request came in at $373.2 million, which is the highest request we've ever submitted. It's a 15% increase since FY18 and about a 2.2% increase since last year. If you look at the past 5 years, obviously there's a big gap between what we're asking for and what really is able to be provided based on our local revenues. So as I mentioned, in FY17, 18, and 19, you can see how the appropriations have been challenged, again, due to the federal tax cuts. And at that point, GDOE had to play its part and do its part in leading the effort to restructure our budget, make the cuts necessary to adjust to that revenue environment. And so we've done that. I think we've gone over that in past hearings. And as you can see, it's not just the appropriations level. I mean, that's the job that the legislature takes on, but then again, trying to ensure that the cash comes in. And you can see that in some periods, there is a shortfall in some years in terms of the cash provided. So over the course of time, GDOE has had to adjust and had to make the necessary cuts and adjustments and anticipate some of those cash shortfalls so we can try to make things work from year to year. So based on our numbers, the cash shortfall over 17 to 21 was about 7.1 million. And then, of course, we just mentioned a total of about 12% decline of about 25 million in our appropriations level. In FY21, we're still kind of in the middle of that fiscal year, so we don't know the cash situation at the end of the year. But I will say that the administration has been fairly good in keeping up with its, with our cash needs, especially in the general fund. This year, it's the same thing. The general fund has been coming in. We're just paying attention to the special funds, including the TEF, in terms of any shortfall that might happen before the end of this year, and also any ways to address that shortfall. So we're in communication with the governor and Department of Administration on those fronts. And then, of course, the big question is FY22. So this is really just a look at the last 5 years in terms of context. Let me go to the next slide. I know hopefully you can see this on your slides, and maybe for those at home can also, I know it's a lot of information, but what's changed since January? I mean, it started to change since last year, but really what's changed since January, when the budget process ended and resulted in the board's approval and the department's request, is the 3 waves of federal funding supports that have come our way to Guam in support of education. So last year in March 2020, we had the Public Law 116-136, which was the CARES Act. And from the CARES Act, the governor received $12.5 million, and Guam Department of Education, as the state education agency, received $41.5 million. So that was a total of $54 million that was enacted in March of last year. And of course, that was around the same time that we shut down. So a lot of these funds, of course, were aimed at looking ahead to ensure the immediate safety of employees and students in terms of trying to shift to distance learning. That was the first round of investments, and trying to support distance learning models, including hard copy models, as we tried to plan for the coming school year. Please note that when we say $41.5 million, that's to the state education agency, and then within that, funds that are allocated to GDOE are available because the DOE has opted to provide equitable services. The participating charter schools and private nonprofit schools, that funding then is allocated. I mean, the services are allocated on the basis of enrollment at the charters, at the private schools, and at our traditional public schools. So it's not all going to DOE, but it is being allocated to our participating charter and private schools as a means of supporting all of our school children. In December of last year, a second wave was PL 116-260, which it's the Consolidated Appropriations Act. We refer to it as ESF2. I think all of you, we've talked about it. ESF is the Education Stabilization Fund. This was part 2, and we received a total of $144 million, 33 of which went to the governor's office, and then $110.6 million to the Guam Department of Education. So again, those funds, we can talk a little further as needed, but those funds, of course, have been moved. We're moving forward to continue to support the safety of our schools, the shift to distance learning, and so on and so forth. And then finally, and the most significant round of investment was Public Law 117-2, the American Rescue Plan. That allocated $287 million to Guam Department of Education, and the focus of those funds are now on recovery. While the first two rounds were more for immediate response and shifting to distance learning and so forth, these funds here are really targeted towards reopening schools, sustaining a safe environment, returning to face-to-face instruction, and then also significantly addressing what's been called learning loss as a result of the pandemic. So in total, we're talking about $485 million that has come in and is available to the Guam Department of Education and a portion to the governor for the next few years. CARES Act expires in September 30, 2022. That's the date to obligate the funds. September 30, 2023 is for the second round, the ESF2 funds to be obligated. And then September 30, 2024, the ARP funds, that's when the obligation deadline comes. So that is a significant amount, and we're very, unfortunately there was a pandemic needed that resulted in these funds being required to support schools, but that's what Guam has been able to benefit from. An important condition is there at the bottom, and as part of each of these grants that have come through, there is a requirement for Guam to meet the maintenance of effort in order to receive those federal funds. So I wanted to mention that and highlight that, and we'll come back to it towards the end of the presentation to kind of clarify what that MOE is for the coming fiscal year. Because of the federal funds, I know that many of you, the senators and other stakeholders have been asking, well, what does that mean then in terms of using those federal funds to meet the needs of the school system? And we recognize that we had a very large request, $373 million, and we also recognize the intent and purposes of these funds being provided by the federal government. Unlike formula grants that we typically receive every year, there's been a lot more flexibility in the use of these funds. So it did allow us to do things that we've never really been allowed to do before, including capital improvement projects that we are really targeting with this third round of ARP funds. In our conversation with Senator San Agustin and of course with our board members, what we wanted to do is, given our initial request, was go back into, to our request and review what the federal funds were planned to be spent on, and go back and if we could remove it from our budget request, because we didn't need to ask our local government and our local coffers to support those projects, go ahead and remove them so we could give a clearer picture to our local officials as to what our needs were and how much relief we could provide through the use of these federal funds. So in the next slide, you'll see that you'll see the initial request and then the amended request that was approved in June by the board. So the initial request was $373.2 million, and as you can see, broken out between the major categories, we had $226.5 allocated to personnel, $85.2 million to operations, $18 million to utilities, and a significant amount, $43.4 million, allocated to capital improvements. Based on the CARES Act, ESF2, and the ARP, based on our review and our discussion with the board, we went back and amended that request by removing items that we believe could be funded by the federal resources. So now the amended request really shows an impact on two areas, the capital outlay and the operations. Personnel really stays the same because we're not spending the federal funds on hiring new personnel, or definitely not permanent personnel. And then on the utilities side, that really isn't the intended use of those federal funds. However, we were able to reduce the operations budget, which by about half, and almost totally remove the capital outlay budget, going down from $43.5 million down to 1.8. So we'll go into the details and exactly what's still in the budget and what's removed, but that's what the board directed that we do after going through the federal funds and laying out our spending priorities. Next slide, please. So what you see is a request of $291.4 million. That's an $82.6 million reduction, or 22% reduction from the request that we submitted in January. It doesn't quite add up as an 82.6 reduction, because we had to add a little bit more back, around $878,000, to cover the nurse pay increase per Public Law 3268 and per the DOA, or the governor's implementation, which is supposed to start in August of this year. So we hadn't factored that into our request, so we went back and factored that annual cost into the personnel budget. So then the major changes in the budget, in addition to the nurses' increase, was reducing operations by $41.1 million and reducing capital outlay by $41.6. Next slide, please. So as all of you are well aware, the bulk of the budget, when it is finally approved and prioritized, really goes to supporting the personnel side of the agency. And here's a breakdown of some of those items, including the staffing pattern that we currently have in place as of September 30 of last year, which is about $209 million. We have an allocation for substitute teachers. We had to really cut back on substitutes over the past several years because of some of the budget cuts. We're trying to get back to having at least a 10%, one for every 10 classroom teachers back in our schools, especially during this time of recovery where we were looking to ensure adequate personnel on campus. We allocated funding for the merit bonus. I think we discussed this with Senator Nelson, that even though based on the implementation of the CWA, our interpretation is that merit bonuses are frozen, even though we should be continuing to book them should funds become available at a later date. So we continue to evaluate employees. We continue to record any merit bonuses that are earned, but we have not been able to pay those. So there is a backlog that exists in terms of merit bonus. We also have an allocation, and this is a question, again, Senator Nelson, you asked about the bonus retention incentive program. I'm sure some of you might have heard some of the personnel back in the years 2004 to school year 2005, 2006. There were a couple of years where it appears that the BRIP program was in place and employees enrolled and were registered to receive this benefit. But due to the lack of funds, it was never paid out. So, of course, I wasn't there at the time, and I don't believe any of the board members really recall that situation. But because we had heard it from stakeholders, we actually went through the process of identifying and reaching out to employees who believed that they were properly, owed this incentive, so that we could calculate what might be, considered an amount needed to make them whole. And so that amount comes to roughly $1 million, and we've included that in our budget request for funding. Salary increments are in there, the nurses' additional pay. I think the nurses all received a 15% base pay increase, and then they received a differential based on their location. So our DOE school nurses received the 15% plus the 10% for being at DOE. I believe public health gets gets 15% differential, and then GMH gets 20%. So we are accounting for that in our revised budget request. And then you also have the other items as well, all adding to $227.4 million. Next slide, please. So we do recognize, of course, and this always comes up in our budget hearings, looking at the number of positions that we have and are requesting. So I did want to go ahead and clarify right up front that the personnel budget request includes a request for 276 new positions, which is about $11.2 million of the total personnel requests. These actually really fall into two major categories. And again, this might just continue to be an ongoing budgetary and policy discussion. Right now, we recognize in our special education program, which is really primarily funded with federal funds, in order to provide the necessary aids needed per the individualized educational plans of our students, we have had to stretch resources by hiring limited-term part-time employees with those federal funds. However, over the last several years, we've been discussing the need to really address that situation, because what happens is that the employees who you are training to address and take care of our most vulnerable students are the first ones to leave if there are available full-time positions elsewhere in the department, in other government agencies, or better positions in the private sector. So the turnover, of course, it hurts our ability to maintain those employees and build them, that build their skills and build their knowledge. It also affects the children, who many of them rely on the familiarity and basically the year-to-year relationship building with their aides. So we put it in there because we're trying to find a solution to be able to fund these one-to-one aides on a full-time basis. And so we proposed 164 new full-time positions at a cost of 6.2 as a starting point in that discussion. Additionally, the other components include personnel requirements that are, for the most part, found in our collective bargaining agreements. So we put that in there as well, pursuant to our agreement with the Guam Federation of Teachers, to add to our budget. Just as a note of information, we are about to begin the process of negotiating or renegotiating the contracts going forward. So we anticipate that this will continue to be a matter of discussion with the union and the board and our management team. So I believe the staff and the teachers' contracts are up for negotiation again. Next slide, please. So the personnel budget didn't really change that much from what was requested in January. The operations budget did, and so we are requesting in the operations side $44.1 million. And I wanted to go through just some of the major drivers. First of all, and maybe Senator San Agustin, your staff can assist with this, but Senator Nelson and I were discussing this yesterday about the $15 million federal meal reimbursement. So, and the question was whether or not the local government was funding that up front and then being reimbursed later, and therefore, having this $15 million that needed to be accounted for. It was my understanding, but I did go back to confirm that what happens is that upon the approval and validation of invoices, these funds are drawn down directly from the federal government to the vendor. So they do not come to the local government. We don't get reimbursed. And so therefore, we actually don't need the $50 million appropriated. It is, but however, I think our budget team has said that the instructions that they receive per BBMR require that they reflect that in our budget. But I wanted to clarify that because that's the 35% of our request is in the federal meal reimbursement, and it really is almost like an accounting measure. It doesn't involve cash coming to the agency for reimbursement at a later date. What does matter, however, is the local school meal subsidy, which is the $5.3 million. So based on the approved reimbursement, the meal reimbursement rates that we get from USDA, it does not cover the entire cost of the meals that are provided. So there is still a subsidy and a portion that local government still pays, and that amount is 5.3. So that is the amount that actually is needed from our, in our budget. The remaining items there, E-rate, custodial services, we can go on. We can answer any questions you have at a later date regarding these items. But these are what remain in the budget after the review of the federal items. Let me just. I know we'll get questions later, but the third-party fiduciary is still. We are still required for the coming year to have a third-party fiduciary, so that is in the budget as well. Our textbooks are at 1.5. We are able to support a lot of instructional materials, including hardcover materials, through the use of the federal funds. But what we're asking for, I think Senator San Agustin and staff, we had talked about the possibility of having this continued $1.5 million in the budget with the ability to roll those funds over so that when the federal funds go away, we can have a reserve there for future prioritization of textbooks and instructional materials beyond 2024. Next slide, please. So that's what's in the budget. We took out $41.1 million, and you'll see the list here. Again, if you're at home, you could probably see it better, or if it's in a paper form. But we were able to remove a lot of different items based on what what was allowable under the federal grant. So any item that relates to the safety and upkeep of schools in terms of the facilities, so the air conditioning replacement and maintenance, the grass cutting, elevators, and so forth, were included in the federal funds, and we were able to remove those types of items from the local budget. The instructional supplies, maintenance supplies, COVID-19 supplies, and so forth, all of those items are also included and able to be supported in our federal, with our federal funds. And then finally, like we talked about with textbooks and instructional materials, collateral equipment from the schools, technology, all of those too, we're looking at targeting what we can with our federal funds. So at the end of the day, we removed $41.1 million out of operations, and these are the items that are no longer in our request. Next slide, please. Utilities, we didn't anticipate, or we're not, and we aren't using any of the federal funds, and we don't usually typically to support the utilities. However, and so that amount stays the same based on the rates and based on our projections. The budget did not take into account the 30% LEAC increase, so we may have to do some work with the committee to figure out exactly what that impact will be. But otherwise, this request stays the same as it was in January when we submitted it. I do want to note that this year we are actually this summer beginning the installation of solar panels at John F. Kennedy High School. And that will be a pretty major project, both roof-mounted and ground-mounted solar, that will enable us to actually begin to pilot solar energy in our schools. And I think as the legislatures wanted to see, be able to identify savings and then project savings based on further use of alternative energy in our schools. So we're looking forward to that project happening. The installation is supposed to be completed by the end of August, and then this year should be fully functional. So we'll be happy to keep you updated on that initiative. Next slide, please. So the capital outlay budget was up at I believe $43 million. It's now at $1.8 million because we were able to remove 96% of those funds and look to leverage the federal resources to address those needs. So we did have some items that are still in the budget, including things like the sports facility fund, which is really a limited gaming fund initiatives that was approved by the legislature. So those proceeds from limited gaming go to support the sports equipment and sports facility improvements. Pre-K expansion is another item. Special education buses, projects for facilities and maintenance, and then some of the technology supports needed. So that comes out to $1.8 million, and the rest we removed. On the next slide, we can share some of those items. So all the items here are actually requests from the schools, also reflecting a request from the board at the very top. So I know the board a couple of years ago has asked and wants, is looking forward to the conversion of Chief Brody into a central middle school. And that's the most expensive item at $10.6 for that renovation. In addition, Simon Sanchez Construction Management Services, those funds we were looking at needing as part of the construction and financing component of the project. And then you can see the list of flooring repairs, classroom repairs, the temporary buildings that need to be removed and made more permanent, restroom renovations, demolition, roofing, everything across the board that I know all of you are aware of if you've been to our schools or if you've heard from any of our stakeholders. There's a lot of need there, and we're very lucky to have the ability to receive federal funds that can be used for these purposes. Prior to the ARP, we've been relying on Department of Interior support in an amount of about $1 million per year to support some of our capital needs. But going forward with the ARP, those capital improvement projects are now part of what we call sustaining safe school environments coming out of this pandemic. And so those projects are allowable and will be included as part of our federal funding under ARP. Now the details are all going to be worked out as we go forward, because at the same time that we are setting these items aside, or for for federally funded purposes, we also, I think you're familiar with we have a master facilities plan process that is underway, supported by the Department of Interior and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So we're about halfway through the planning process right now with a firm called HFF Planners out of Hawaii, which is a contractor with U.S. Army Corps. What they've done is, in addition to beginning the planning process and engaging with stakeholders, we were also able to get engineers on the ground here on Guam back in May and early June to update the facility by facility assessment that they last did in 2013, when they identified $90 million in deferred maintenance that needed to be addressed. That was good back then to have an assessment done, but of course we didn't have $90 million of funding available to address that. What DOI was able to provide was a commitment of $5 million at $1 million a year that we've been able to stretch up to about $7 million now. So the situation's different. We have a facilities plan that's underway. We have an updated assessment that'll be completed by the end of August. And when we get that assessment, get the data, and get the cost estimates for addressing those items, what we plan to do is to reallocate or to align those projects with the ARP grant that where we've set aside funding to address these types of issues, and leveraging both federal resources, we think we'll be able to effectively use these funds to address the facility needs across the island. So next slide, please. So again, that was a description of what's in and what's out of the budget, and we're happy to come back and answer questions about operations. Before I get to this basically the last couple of slides, I should have prefaced it, but let me just say it now. The budget is predicated on a full face-to-face instructional year. So we've been working to try to reopen schools, and not reopen schools like we did last semester, where we were alternating cohorts and running 3 models of learning. Our focus and our emphasis is on face-to-face instruction for 5 days a week, beginning in August, when we open the doors on August 12th to our students. We've been working, hand in hand with public health and the governor to make sure that with everything, that we allow for this, and that the guidance and the public health parameters give us the ability to do this. And based on the recent CDC guidance that came out over the last weekend, we now know that we do have the ability to do full 5 days of instruction this school year. And so we're very happy that the island has continued to improve its health situation, which then allows us the flexibility to open our schools up as part of our island's broader reopening. And the federal funding part is really going to be a critical aspect to meeting these goals. So the slide I have up before you today has to do with the MOE, which is the maintenance of effort. This is a condition of the federal grants that we've received, and we received 3 of them. The first one being CARES, the second one being the ESF2 grant, and then the third one being the ARP. I provided the committee basically a calculation of all of the various MOEs as they apply to different fiscal years. But I wanted to also just focus on FY22. So because the 3 grants have their maintenance of effort, when CARES came out, the maintenance of effort really focused basically on the average dollar amount that needed to be provided to support elementary and secondary education. And they used the cash received by GDOE in FY17, 18, and 19 as the basis for determining that maintenance of effort. And that maintenance of effort then needed to be met in FY20 and FY21. So that's not what we're here to discuss. That's already, FY20 is done, FY21 is still underway. But that's really what the CARES Act required when it first came out. Shifting to both the ESF2 and the ARP grants, the maintenance of effort has changed. And basically what was required is, to try to clarify it, it's the proportion of Guam's support or expenditures on elementary and secondary education relative to Guam's overall spending averaged out over FY17, 18, and 19. So we're looking at spending levels, comparing what was spent on elementary and secondary education to what was spent by the government of Guam, and then applying that percentage as the maintenance of effort that needs to be met in FY22 and FY23. So for us, in our calculations, we're funded, operationally, our funds come from the general fund and from the TEF funds. All the other items that come to us, including the Passport to Libraries Fund and the Healthy Futures Funds, all of those are special funds with direct and statutory purposes. So what's collected there goes to DOE for those statutory purposes. However, TEF and the general fund are appropriated each year for the operations. So we didn't focus on the special funds. We focused only on general fund and TEF, and we went back to 17, 18, and 19 to reflect the levels of general fund and TEF in those years, and then DOE's total expenditures over that same time from our general fund and TEF resources. So in FY17, the percentage that we received was 29%, that we spent was 29%, 18, 30%, FY19, 29%, for an average of 29%. So in order to meet the maintenance of effort in FY22, the requirement is that 29% of spending needs to be met, to support elementary and secondary education needs to be met relative to the general fund and TEF spending that goes on this year. Since we're at the beginning of the year and we don't know what the actual spending will look like, all we can do is plan. And so the way we're proposing that the maintenance of effort be met is that whatever the projected general revenue and TEF revenue levels are in this coming budget, that DOE be appropriated the 29% as a minimum requirement to meet maintenance of effort, which will then allow us to ensure the access to the federal funds that have been made available. So I know there might be more questions on this. I know working with the committee and staff for both the Education Committee and the Appropriations Committee, provided the April maintenance of effort guidance, which actually does a good job of breaking out these calculations and these issues. Also provided our calculations for every fiscal year that's impacted, and we're happy to continue that discussion. We did share this with the governor's office because this maintenance of effort requirement is not just DOE's, it also applies to the governor's funds, which are the 12.5 and the 33 million that the governor has. And it also, I believe, applies to the higher education entities as well. So we are working hand in hand with the governor because whatever she reports, we want to make sure our numbers match when we go because we're both reporting to the same agency. So we should be consistent in our efforts, and it's my understanding that the governor does support meeting the maintenance of effort in this budget. So that's based on our discussions with her. Next slide, please. So really, this just sums up, and in bold, it really is our request at this appropriations hearing. We've been blessed to have federal resources that are going to be able to help us meet a lot of unmet needs in the school system, and we want to maintain access to those funds so we can continue to invest those funds in many needed areas. In order to do that, we need to meet the MOE, and that's what we're here to request that the legislature do in the course of its budget discussions and its budget negotiations. So with that said, our final slide, si Diyos Maasi, and we thank you for the opportunity to testify and are available to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Fernandez. I only have a few questions, real simple. What's the status? Did you ever send a request for waiver of the MOE, maintenance of effort?
So
You did or you didn't?
well, remember there's 5 different years. Well, there's 4 different years that it applies to. So the CARES Act applies to FY20 and FY21.
Okay.
So FY20 is the only year that's complete. We're working with the governor's office to review that number. We think that the MOE was met, and we're just trying to affirm that in FY20. And FY21, that number will come when the audited numbers come out. We'll be able to determine whether we met that maintenance of effort. It was kind of unfair to give us a maintenance of effort when we're right in the middle of the fiscal year, but if we don't meet those, then we definitely will apply for the MOEs for those years. That's 20 and 21.
Okay.
FY22, we haven't applied for the waiver. I think we're not able to yet until I believe September or October.
Okay.
After October 1st, it would be the first chance to request a waiver.
All right, no problem. Thank you. Next one is, you remember when we were trying to figure out a way how to get solar panels all over the schools? Has GPA ever came back to DOE and said, this is the best way to do it? Did they do anything other than they weren't going to support DOE going to solar? I'm just curious.
Well, GPA is, we look to GPA as a good partner in our schools and assisting us with what they can. But with regard to solar, no. A lot of GPA is focused on the demand side. So they are doing some LED retrofits in a couple of our schools this year. But as far as solar, we're really looking at JFK as the first opportunity to get that up and running because, without the real numbers, it's kind of hard to have the argument as to whether or not it's going to be more expensive or less when we get into this debate. So that's why we're letting you know. Let's monitor this. We hope it should be implemented this year, but we should be able to see pretty quickly whether there are savings available.
Well, John, the only reason why was when we were discussing that, they were very explicit, and they justified across this island. They know better than even the solar company. And I'm just curious that they haven't brought anything to you. And I'm not going to keep waiting and waiting until it's inevitable that it's true. Solar will make it cheaper.
Yep.
Not unless they can prove otherwise, but
I'll bring it up in my next meeting with Mr.
Please.
Beneventi.
Remind them of how important, how they justified why you shouldn't go solar.
Yeah.
Because that's 13 million you pay a year? If that can go down to 6 and you get that money, you get that funds to do what you need to do,
Correct.
then we move on. When you mentioned the Army Corps you're working on and trying to follow with the Army Corps' evaluation on the $90+ million deferment on the schools, from that date to this date, has there been any upgrades or any maintenance or repairs to the schools? I mean, I don't know if you've got funds.
What happened in 2013 when we were getting the assessment done, we were also in the process of spending down the ARA funds. So we were able to use ARA funds to address some of those items. So we were able to bring that amount, I believe, address up to 60 million of that amount. So bringing it down to about 30 million. But then over time, you get more and more deferred maintenance. So the ARA funds helped. And then, of course, DOI provided its own separate $7 million to go towards electrical repairs and canopy replacements and so forth. And so we actually still are working with DOI funds as we speak. We're getting a bunch of those canopy replacements approved so we can get those going. Okay,
next one. I'm from Zigua, Simon Sanchez. Part of the ARP money and the United States government's push, reopening of schools, fixing schools. Where are we at with Simon Sanchez? When are we going to start breaking ground and start building it? So I'm very curious to know where it's at because I know a lot of people from Jigo are watching this, find out what's going on for their schools.
Okay, so I'm hoping that we can have a more public briefing within a month, not within a month, after about a month from now. they are completed the 30% submittal of their design based on, and they're working with a planning committee based out of Simon Sanchez stakeholders. So what they've been able to do is come up with conceptual design. They've been walking through we told them walk through the other schools like JFK and Okadu and make sure we're not going too big or too small, because we know that costs are going up. And so we're trying to be very, we're trying to focus in on making sure this is cost effective. And so I just saw the earlier progress this morning. And so it looks like we'll be ready to go have a more public discussion within a month. We just wanted to make sure that we settled some outstanding issues with the committee that are still kind of moving around that might affect the overall design. The timeline right now foresees groundbreaking probably around May or June of next year. We'd like to see it move up, but it really will, we're looking at moving that up as much as possible. A lot of that takes the stars aligning and, perfectly to make that happen. But I'm very pleased that we're finally, getting conceptual designs and getting that work done. The next step this fall is for us to bring on construction management support to help us monitor and manage the project as we get to the later parts of design and start the solicitation for the next round. The solicitation that will go out is with construction management, and then the final one would be for construction and financing. That's the vendor that's going to take the drawings at the 100% design and then bid on it, and hopefully be able to be awarded and break ground within that time frame that I just stated. So we're getting there, and again, hopefully by the end of when we come back to school, start the school year again, we'll be able to do a broader presentation, especially up there in Jigo for the Simon Sanchez community.
All right, so what are we looking at? Break ground, when are we looking at?
Like I said, the latest right now is the projection is for May or June of next year. I'm hoping to move it earlier, but
Simon Sanchez. Yeah, I know that the oversight chair would love to hear Simon Sanchez get done. One last question. Since 2016, DOE's population keeps going down every year, 1,000 students a year. The cost has not changed. I understand management of schools still will generally stay within the same area. But if it keeps going down, 2016, 30,000, 17, drop another 800 students, 2018, 29,000, 2019, 2020, still at 29,000, but it lost like, it was almost 1,000 students, and now 2021, you're at 27,000, and whatever the numbers change as we move forward.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that you're not, I know you're going to try to figure out a way how to fund parts of the school, because even if you only have 10 students, you still have to fund the classroom as if it was 35. I understand that.
Correct.
You're still going to need a teacher. You're still going to need those stuff. But I just want to make sure that we're running the books right, and that whatever funding you're required or you need, it's stated there, because otherwise the people of Guam looks at it as 27,000 students. Okay, divide that by 270 million, $10,000 a student. It's kind of high. I'm just concerned. Right. We want to make sure that we're doing what we can, and you're doing what you can, and the body is trying its effort to help you.
So we are just like you. We've been tracking the year-to-year enrollment, and we've seen that decline. And I think at this point, trying to make sure we can predict or see when it's going to stabilize. I mean, early on, we were able to attribute almost student by student the impact of opening charter schools. So there were charter schools that would open, and then you would see the decline in the elementary side and high school side. And so we recognize, and we could explain that as part of the population stays the same, but you got charters, you got different providers, so that wasn't as much of a concern because you have a limit on the number of charters that you currently have. We went through also a period, another year where we saw the decline in the high school level. It also, unfortunately, was the year when somebody was giving out, I think, 200 diplomas that were not official. And so, I mean, we only learned that through the case where there were like 200 victims who, you know, basically withdraw themselves from school because they graduated. So that was one of the years. But I think overall, with the facilities planning effort that we're doing, as part of that plan, they've looked at the demographics, and they're looking also at what's happening in other areas. So what you're observing is not just a matter of charters and you know, that 1 year of fake diplomas, but you're also seeing that overall demographically, a lot of areas are seeing the same thing, steadying stabilization or decline in population. And this may be a matter of the birth rate and the family sizes and all of that. So that's one thing that we are looking at, and it's enabled us to do things at Simon Sanchez where we were projecting for a higher number for the new school, and we're saying, look, we're not going to get close to that based on these projections. Let's go ahead and operate with a lower number and keep our costs in check. So we don't need to build that huge school if it's going to, you know, we can project.
And that's what I was hoping I would
Yeah.
hear from you, because any of the renovations or upgrades that you do to the schools, why upgrade it to 1,800 student when you already know it's down to 12?
The biggest
Do the
issue,
adjustment, right?
yeah, the biggest issue really that you're going to see again is the concentration of the students. So even if you have the same amount, if they all start getting housing in the north, that need for a central middle school is really a critical one, because most of the population is up north. Our buses have a hard time going south and then north again to PD and Untitled and so forth. So that was what the board was trying to address. But, you know, it doesn't matter if the population is not changing. If they all go north, then our resources have to reflect the same. And it also raises into question, how do we support our southern schools? So those are the kinds of things we're about to enter in our planning effort. We welcome you. Of course, we're going to present to the legislature as well, because it does get into those discussions about how do you fix schools that are under-enrolled but have huge facilities and still need to be, you know, supported.
That's correct.
Yeah, so, you know, I know that in the past that sometimes translated into things like school closures. We're looking more at how do you consolidate schools and then build better facilities more efficiently.
And that was
Yeah.
going to be my final question. Are you looking at possible redistricting? You're going to be taking a look at that, right?
At redistricting, so we have looked at that, and again, the critical piece in that is the middle schools.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's, actually the plan was already put in place, but until we get a central middle school, you know, it's kind of hard to shift some of those populations.
Understood.
Yeah, right
Not a
now,
problem.
and you know this, right now, if you are a student in Harmon, you go to school at Untitled Middle School. If you're in Tamuning, you go to Jose Rios. And that's really what's complicating this, you know, this map where we're trying to build schools where the kids live versus finding ways to bus them all over the island. So, so that is a matter that the board will continue to work on.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
You want to make that announcement? The water's up? Okay, just to let everybody know that unfortunately, the water was turned off here in our building. Or a water break in the area. They're gonna turn down the aircon, so hopefully we're not here too long. It's something that the Department of Education goes through, I know that, okay? And maybe
Usually
we all get to feel it one time, but I know that goes on in some of the schools. But I'm gonna move on to Senator Nelson, the oversight, and then Senator Amanda. We're also joined by Senator Joanne Brown, and then we'll move along and hopefully we'll be out of here before we overheat. Thank you. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to request that for the additional funding that you are receiving, the $268 million, if you could prepare a plan for us to have an informational hearing to discuss that perhaps during the month of August. So it looks like
Yes.
you have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, so we are, yes, absolutely. So we're basically in the final stages of the details of the ARP.
Okay.
And so we definitely would be, look forward to an opportunity to share what's in there.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Superintendent. And I just want to give kudos to your staff and everyone at DOE again for the hard work that they've done. I know summer school was a very difficult transition. It was a lot of work and a lot of late nights. So thank you for all of that, and if there's anything we can do to help you as the new school year comes or approaches, we're more than happy to stay late with you. So just holler, okay? So thank you very much, and thank you for the good work that you've been doing.
Thank you, Senator, and thanks for meeting with us earlier as well. And I just, all I would say is that this year coming, this year that's coming upon us is one where we really are prioritizing the return to school. And obviously we want to do that safely, so what happens in the community is going to be important. But I hope that you and also your colleagues will continue to see schools as critical to the opening of the island, because what we know is that our parents can't go back to work if they got to keep their kids at home, and we've heard that. They can't get access to the food, the nurses, the socials, lots of things that schools do to support the families. So we'd like to be a part of that recovery, whatever those challenges are this coming year.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. Senator Shelton, do you have any questions or comments at this time?
Thank you, Senator Nelson. I think I have a lot of questions, but maybe I'll save them for like an info hearing with the department, not necessarily related to DOE, but you have so much going on that I have questions about, and obviously following along with your meetings and in the media. And I appreciate everything that you're doing. As Senator Nelson said, all the good work at the department for our students. We're so grateful for everything. I wanted to ask about the high-risk designation, if you can just give us an update. I know I ask every time we have a hearing about what we can be expecting so we can free up that money to go to other priorities within the department.
Yes, I'll say it plainly that we were really impacted by the pandemic because we've been looking forward to finalizing the completion of our reconsideration plan and getting them to validate our completion and so forth. So we were scheduled for a visit last summer, and then of course the pandemic hit. So the best that we could do, and we just insisted, we said, please, if we can do a virtual monitoring, please set that up, because we don't want to go another year and not have any of the progress recognized. So we did actually get that done. And then one of the challenges we're dealing with now is the transition. As you know, transition in the department has taken some time, not only because of the shutdown of the federal government. I mean, everybody's basically working from home as when we are having our calls and regular meetings. Plus the leadership, we were very happy to have leadership that supported us in this last, at least the deputy was there to kind of help drive. And so we're just waiting for the new appointees to come in so we can share our story here on Guam and have that same level of attention so that things can move in that bureaucracy. But getting down to the specifics, there are two major areas that are associated with this final stage of hopefully getting off these special conditions. One is the improvements that have been made around the property inventory. So we were put on a probationary status, which was meant in a good way, right? Not in a negative way. That we were a probationary status to see how we operated this year, and if we do a good job, then that should lead to removing the property management component out of the oversight of the third party. So we are in the process of completing the annual inventory, and of course, it's not as easy as it would normally be, because in addition to the normal inventory, we have about 10,000 new assets that we have to go and make sure we tag and account for as part of this year's inventory. In addition, we took some of our laptops that were usually at school, we pushed them out to the students. We're told that we have to make sure we account for them, so we're telling the students this summer, okay, bring them back in, let's make sure we inventory them, and then you can take it back. And those are the only two pieces that are needed for us to complete this year. And so our due date is in September to submit that, and that'll be one major initiative that should be hopefully positive. The second area is employee time tracking. And what I'm very happy to report is that through the federal programs and with some of the federally funded activities, we've begun piloting an automated employee time tracking system. So, for an agency this size, that's a big endeavor. But really, we're going to automated time tracking. So that means you got the time tracking mechanisms, you've got the cards, you've got the ability to check in on your laptops or your phones. as part of reporting your time and attendance. And that automation, that pilot has gone well, so we're looking to go live, hopefully by the end of August, go live so that that hits directly into payroll and people are then paid on the data that's coming through the automated system. If that works, we're planning to expand that to the rest of our federally funded activities and hopefully locally. And that will put us on par with a lot of private sector organizations that use those systems for time and attendance. So that's something US GDOE has been very interested in. They're really supportive of. And we're hoping that completion of that project will also bode well. So the next anticipated opportunity for their virtual monitoring will probably be November. We're also in the process of renegotiating the third-party contract for the coming year. And based on what we know from the last year, there really has, because travel has been limited and so forth, we do think that there's opportunity for even further savings in terms of now that we're operating in this COVID-19 environment, we might be able to get further savings on that contract front. So that's what we can report, and of course, we'll shoot for November and inform you of that progress.
All right, thank you. We'll be looking forward to that, and thank you all for the work that you're doing again, especially that you're able to continue making progress, though you have been very, very affected by the pandemic. We're still, proud of everything that you're accomplishing and adapting to right now to provide for our students. So thank you for that. And I wanted to say congratulations also on having your plan approved by the Department of Agriculture for the SNAP for all of the students. I'm sure many, many families are looking forward to that benefit coming in. It's going to help greatly over the next couple of months as we continue to feel the effects of this pandemic. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Senator Paris, do you have any questions or comments for the panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon to the superintendent and the panel that's here today. I guess I have a couple of follow-up questions. So I'm glad that you covered new positions. Does that include vacant positions?
No, so the vacant positions are included in the existing staffing pattern because, and then that's a point in time estimate, and then the new positions are really separate from that.
Okay, do you have an estimate of how many vacant positions there are?
I don't off the top of my head. We do, typically when they're school-based, they get filled, in a timely manner because they're out of the schools. So the vacancies that we were holding were mostly in the central office because we had frozen hiring in the central office for the period of time after FY18. And so right now, that's where you'll find most of the vacancies. Unfortunately, that's creating some pressure on us because of all the activities that are now coming through Central due to the federal funds. So I can get that information to the committee. I think my budget staff can be hearing this outside, so we'll get that information to the committee.
Okay, thanks. Are there teacher vacancies?
Yes, absolutely. There are teacher vacancies, and at this particular point, we're not far off from where we are normally this school year, but it really is between now and August, the start of the school year, where we're tracking to see whether those teachers who usually come in at this stage and say, usually the retirees are the ones that are coming in and saying, okay, I'm going to return and for next year and be able to double dip, and they're the ones filling those last 200 positions that we typically have. And so with a shortage, we typically end up with about 50 that we're chasing down, trying to fill at the first week of school, and then working from there. This year, I think you're probably hearing the same concern as to whether we'll get those same teachers back, given COVID-19 and some of the maybe anxieties associated with returning to face-to-face instruction. So that is our same concern. Mm-hmm. Again, I think we've seen, teachers more, I guess, making decisions now finally after, maybe a few years of thinking about this. COVID-19 has really pushed decisions to retire. We've seen teachers resign for other reasons, health reasons, personal reasons this school year. It's a matter of whether or not, as we reopen, that they will be willing to return based on, a lot of it will be based on their feeling about whether it's safe in the community and then safe in our schools.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I remember last budget cycle there was roughly about 300, if I recall correctly, there were 300 teacher vacancies. What was the outcome with the?
Well, usually with about 300 vacancies, we typically can fill about 200 or 250 of them with retirees. And then we end up with about 50 that we're working with the UOG and trying to find interested. So again, it's really whether or not we meet that amount. And we're out there trying to get them to join up again. But that's where that 300 vacancies comes from. And really, we're thankful for the ability for double dipping in our department, because we do rely on those retired teachers to come back and help us.
Yeah, because I know that there oftentimes are filled by on-call substitutes. Was there a lot of that last term?
So the on-call substitutes, as a part of our what do you call it, budgetary cut reductions, following FY18, we had actually cut the number in half. So we're now in the process of hiring the substitutes now and discussing the numbers of substitutes that we should be able to hire for this coming school year. But yeah, that had been a challenge in the past, because we had basically cut the number of substitutes in half just as a way to meet our budgetary number, because substitutes are limited term and are easy to be brought on and let go at the same time. But that did hamper our school operations.
Thanks. So the other questions that I have are regards to the maintenance of effort. So I noticed in the budget there are a series of special funds that are part of the appropriations.
Correct.
And so in looking at how you calculate maintenance of effort, you relied on the general fund and the TEF funds. So the formula that you provided, has that been agreed to by US DOE, or is this something that you're proposing?
So there's regular reporting to DOE, the US DOE, on the MOE, and I don't believe this most recent calculation has yet been shared or approved, and they don't necessarily approve it. I think we'll get to a point where we have to demonstrate that it's been met and have those discussions with the US DOE. But at this point, the reasoning behind the general fund and TEF is that those are funds that get appropriated every year for operations, and the special funds typically are already calculated by a certain percentage and allocated to the agency, in law. So limited gaming funds, that's already set out as a certain percentage goes to DOE. So whatever the year is, whatever the collection is, that's the amount that we would get in our budget, and wouldn't necessarily be affected by the other appropriation efforts. So our assumption is that those special funds will continue to flow based on their statutory construction, and that the operational funds that we're really looking at for personnel, contracts, operations, and so forth, will be where the maintenance of effort is met. So for instance, if you do look at the passport funds that go to support libraries, if the passport funds don't get collected at the level that they're, then that just means less resources for libraries out of those funds, and that might be, those are easier to address because they're tied to that specific revenue stream. But for the others, in some years, with regard to TEF, we get appropriated a high amount, and in other years we get appropriated a low amount. So, we've actually been pushing not to be exposed to TEF, if possible, because there's been some volatility in the collections, and every time it's short, then we end up short. And the problem is, when we find out we're short, it's already June, and we don't have an opportunity to adjust our operations, to meet the lower budget level. So, so we included it because that's typically how we're funded. But year to year, the amount that comes out of TEF, may change, and we've been pushing to be more get more funding out of the general fund, and we were able to lower that during one budget year. But at this point, we're now at a higher level, and if it gets short like it is this year, we have to watch those funds and see if we can make the necessary adjustments late in the game.
Okay. Because, the calculation here would still fall below what you're requesting for this budget year. So that's something to think about as well.
Yes, yes. No, we do recognize that the amount that we've requested still exceeds, prior appropriations, and even the maintenance of effort requirement wouldn't maybe not get to that level. Our ask, though, is recognizing that we are benefiting from having federal resources available, that at the, even if we know that there are challenges that the government has to face in terms of the financial situation, we were just asking that at the very least, the maintenance of effort requirement be in place so that we don't end up having to, work with USDOE on a possible waiver or risk of losing the funds that are, available now.
Okay, thank you. In regards to contractual expenditures, so in previous years, it was roughly about 34 million, and then this year it's 50.8 million. Why the increase?
Which are you looking at, ma'am?
I was looking at the previous submission. So in the contractual budget, line item, I don't know if you have the original budget submittal. It was 50.8 million for contractual services. In previous years, it was 34 million. So I'm just wondering what the increase is due to.
I'd have to take a look at that schedule. Just let me see if I can pull it up.
What's the question, Senator Perez?
Why the increase in the contractual expenditures? So the proposed budget was 50.8 million. Previous years it was 33 million. So I'm just questioning that.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at what's driving that number. I'm not sure if you're looking at the approved versus the. Are you looking at what we've requested or what was approved?
Yeah, the initial request. So I just wanted to find out what the increase was due to.
Sorry, we have a lot of different versions of this, but if we can come back to it, we'll see if we can track down that number and then come back to that.
Okay, thank you. In regards to the previous budget, how much of it has been encumbered thus far?
The previous?
Or this current budget cycle, how much has been encumbered thus far? How much has been spent?
If you're talking, well, in our budget, a lot of that, first of all, the large portion of it is personnel costs. So what happens is that those funds are basically come in and get spent almost right away, because what we get is an allocation. So if we're talking about the budget, what happens with the budget is that we go to DOA and BBMR, and we work out an allocation through the course of the year. And so they give us a cash allotment every week. And, that comes to about, I would say probably around 3.5 million a week maybe 3.4 million a week now that we get. Looking to confirm the numbers, but we get a weekly allocation, but our payroll is around $7 million. So, once that comes in, most of that just goes out the door. So I don't think we use the term encumbrance for those particular. Let me ask Frank if he can clarify.
So we normally get a release of 3.8 from DOA, and our payroll average is about $7 million. To answer your question on this year's appropriation.
Mr. Cooper, identify yourself.
I'm sorry,
so,
Senator.
So everybody knows who you are. I know who you are, but the others don't. Thank you.
Franklin Cooper Nurse, Acting Deputy of Finance and Administrative Services. So just to answer your question, the DOA release is $3.8 million on a weekly basis. Our payroll is about $7 million. And then to your original question of where we're at in appropriations versus allotments, encumbrance is a little bit different, but just to go with the appropriations, of the $200 million, BBMR has released 172. Cash received to date is 156. So we're trending at about $15.7 million in a difference between cash and the BBMR allotment release.
So if I heard correctly, sorry, you're a bit muffled. So you have a remainder of about 50.7 million left?
15.7 that from allotment to cash received.
Is that a 1.5 or a 5.0?
15.7, 15.7.
Okay, Thanks. I remember when I first started as a teacher, there would be pay less paydays, right? And so it's good to see that the paydays are being kept up. And I guess the question too is whether there's going to be, are there any lapses? Do you anticipate any lapses at this point, considering a lot of the instruction was online or hard copies?
We don't anticipate any lapses. So first of all, you know, we've been dealing with massive reductions, right? So everything we're doing is with a tighter budget. And again, even in the course of these past school years, we've been paying our employees. So we don't anticipate any lapses. In fact, we are more concerned about not receiving the full amount that we anticipate from the appropriation, meaning not the general fund, but mostly from TEF. So, yeah, I know what you're saying, but right now what we're tracking is to meet the budgetary level and hopefully get enough of the cash to make sure we don't have a shortfall. Because even in the course of the COVID-19 year, you know, the most of our budget goes to personnel, and most of those personnel were still in place, even if they were doing hard copy versus, you know, online. I mean, those are teachers and school-based employees who make up the majority of that.
All right, thank you. So in going over the operations, there's a category E-rate. Can you explain what that's for?
So E-rate is it's a federal reimbursement. I think it's through the FCC that is provided to support our technology investments. So they used to be able to support traditional telecommunications, you know, things like your phone systems and so forth. Now these funds help to support some of the more advanced technological investments, including wireless and broadband and so forth. So every year we negotiate with E-rate as to what we will be spending those funds on, and then we get the reimbursement from them. But we have to spend the money up front and then get the reimbursement.
All right. As far as miscellaneous, what's included in that in the operations budget?
Yeah, I don't have that. Sorry, I'm waiting. I wish I had my budget team in here, but let me ask if we can.
Your question is to find out what's in the miscellaneous part on their presentation?
Yes, if they don't have the
No, in the
answers
operations,
now,
yeah.
if they don't have answers now, they could perhaps provide it to the oversight chairs, and me as well.
Yeah, usually in our miscellaneous, we typically include things like the first generation trust fund and so forth that are not really, that are separate, sort of a special funds, but that's not, let me just see if we can confirm what's in the operations budget. Are you looking at the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, I am.
Oh, the miscellaneous ones that actually we were trying to add up to 44.1. So really, that's just a combination of all the smaller operations requests. So these are ones that fall below the $1 million threshold. So we just combined them so we didn't have a question about adding up to the numbers.
Okay. All right, thank you.
So we can break that out if you needed.
Okay, thanks. The other thing is the PPEs and sanitation supplies that are provided to the schools. So I'm hearing from, some teachers that they're not getting the supplies. What is the disbursement of that?
Okay. Well, the general response, and I'll turn it over to, these guys run the programs, but we've heard similar requests, similar issues, and when it comes down to investigating what those issues are, it's really in how the schools are allocating and giving out the resources. So we receive the resources. They come in large part, they come to our main conference room in the central office, so we're doing our best to push them out. And we've pushed them out in substantial quantities and all of them being signed out for. The principals are then responsible for disseminating those supplies. And in the past, when we've intervened and tried to explore it, really is an issue of communication between the employee and the principals, because in some situations the principals are not, are basically trying to stage them and give them out on a regular schedule to ensure that supplies last, versus other schools which might give them out in a different way. But let me go ahead, and I know these guys deal with it more directly, Ike or Joe.
So, thank you, Senator. My name is Joe Sanchez. I'm the Deputy Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction. I'm the project manager for the ESF and the ARP funding. So just to let you know, we of course take claims like that very seriously. And I know that a lot of times when complaints like that are made, people are afraid to identify themselves or they don't want to be known. But what we ask the schools, especially when we get a general claim like that, what we do is we immediately ask all of the principals and all of their points of contact whether or not every protocol was followed with regards to the distribution. Are there any schools that are missing masks or something that a teacher may have needed and not gotten? We call them, we have like a color code where it's like a yellow concern or a red concern, where it's either orders didn't come in. And to be quite frank, that's been very few since the last couple of months. I mean, we have an overabundance in some cases of cleaning supplies and PPEs that are provided to the schools on a regular basis. So what the operations committee in our task force has done is, in addition to the protocols that we had in place in fall, they've actually went an extra step and put additional protocols for the PPE distribution, which includes calculating the burn rate, meaning burn rate as in how often masks are used during the day in relation to how many people are on campus. So they go down to a very fine detail about how many masks are supposed to be distributed, what type of cleaning supplies are distributed, even to the extent of how many times you spray a table in order to wipe it down. So over the last several months, we've been very insistent on making sure that teachers are provided with what's needed, students are provided with what's needed, staff are provided with what's needed, and anytime there are shortages, either because of delivery time or whatever, we try to address those very quickly. But we are aware whenever there are shortages or a challenge that comes up. I know you didn't ask this, but this includes school supplies as well. So the protocols that we follow for safety supplies are pretty much the same protocols that we follow for school supplies when we're distributed. So we know what's ordered, we know what's picked up by the school. There's actually 2 orders. So there's a set that we order from Central that are distributed to the schools. Summer school was like that, plus the beginning of the school year last year was like that, where we ordered in bulk. And then the remaining amounts are ordered directly to the schools. So they order it themselves and then it gets delivered that way. But those protocols are very similar. We identify the number that the school is going to be picking up. It has to be signed out by the individual who's supposed to be picking it up. And when it gets back to the school, the principal or the AO or whoever the representative is has to verify that it got to the school for distribution.
Okay. Thank you for that response. I think that's very important to assure the teachers and also highlight what are the protocols in place. So in case that they're not getting the supplies, they can reach out, hopefully, to the school principal, if not that person, then to you. Okay.
Yes, Senator, I mean, the short answer is there should be sufficient amounts of those, especially those protective supplies at the schools. And so the first thing we recommend is just to make sure that there is communication directly with the principals, because sometimes we do find that employees will come to us without necessarily checking in with the principal for that reason. And then, of course, if it elevates beyond that and becomes an issue, then we can respond to it. But there should be enough supplies, especially given the fact that we budgeted and supplied for anticipating a possible full year of instruction for all students. So we weren't budgeting at the low end. We were purchasing to support the school as if all the students and employees were going to be back. And we know that that's not the case, so there shouldn't be an issue of adequate supply. But, again, forward us any concerns if you hear them.
I think I do hope you prioritize, even like the older buildings that don't have the proper ventilation. So some of these buildings that can open up their windows, there's some buildings such as Sanchez, the central building, you can't open it up to the outdoor air. And so I think that needs to be prioritized as far as ensuring that there's enough, HEPA filters, filtration systems in place.
Yeah, so Principal Bestine has been very active, especially on behalf of the community, because that is the one school that we've been paying close attention to in terms of the COVID-19, response and recovery, knowing that there were already issues surrounding ventilation and, in the main building. So yes, she has brought that to our attention and, alerts us to issues that need to be addressed as they come up.
All right, thank you. In regards to the procurement for Sanchez, I know the last budget cycle, we put in the bill that there was supposed to be quarterly reports on the procurement. And so you had just mentioned that the conceptual design is about 30% complete. So have you submitted any procurement documents or updates to the committee chair?
My understanding is that that requirement was not included in the final bill. Is that, if I'm correct?
Yes,
but
that was...
we're happy to provide. I believe that there was, I was tracking that amendment and I didn't believe that it was in there. But we're happy to work with Senator San Agustin on that. But we'd be happy to provide that update. We have the, like I said, we've been working towards a public presentation. However, the Simon Sanchez Planning Committee has a couple of items that need to be resolved before I think it's, time to share, just because we don't want to come out with a plan that's still moving, at least in concept. So as I committed, by next month, we hope to have a more public sharing of what that 30% looks like so that people have a better idea. That doesn't mean that there won't be any further changes, but there are things that are being discussed with regard to the location of major parts of the facility so that the planners can continue with the design for the entire site. So I'd be happy to submit that, but I don't believe there is a requirement in place, although I know that was discussed during the last cycle.
I remember the amendment passed when we were discussing it.
Yeah, I think that's right. But again, I know there's a lot going on, and I know that Simon Sanchez is almost in the background because we're doing the work even with the other items. But we're happy, again, we were like I said, August 15th is our deadline internally for resolving all outstanding major items that are still unresolved with regard to the concept, so that we can share that and get further input beyond the Simon Sanchez planning stakeholders.
I'd be interested, though, in getting the deliverables. So you did award a contract for design, correct?
We did.
Yeah, okay, so I am interested in the deliverables and the timelines that is in that contract.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to, I'd be happy to deliver that. We can, I'm also offering within that time frame, if the committee or the education committee would like to have that same briefing, we can do that as well. But yeah, I'd be happy to respond with what we have. But we have contracts, we have, there's a lot of paper, a lot of work, and a lot of design work that's going on. So we could, schedule the appropriate type of briefings to give everybody a full picture of what's going on at this point.
Okay, thank you.
But we're close.
Do you have any more questions, Senator
Yes,
Paris?
Yeah.
yes, I do.
Okay, because the clock is ticking, it's going to get warm in here. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind, thank you. So the other thing is the workload output. So I noticed in the previous, the initial budget submittal, you would, under the capital improvement section, it talks about the different levels of accomplishment and what's the anticipated level for 2021 and 2022. So in this document, you have a 10% anticipated level of completion for Simon Sanchez, and then a 50% level of completion for 2022. Does that include, does this include the design and build, or just the design itself?
So the design is separate from the build in this approach. So the design should be, again, by the end of this year, which is 2021, should be at 90% is what we're targeting. You know, obviously we love to expedite it, but our current time frame is around 90%, which allows us to start the procurement, you know, to get the bid out for the project. And by the time they hit 100%, the bids can come in, you know, shortly thereafter. So of course we were discussing ways to advance that, but for this year that would be the design. The phase for construction and financing, that bid will have to go together based on the way the law is structured, because the law requires that the award be based on the lowest aggregate annual lease amount. And that takes into consideration both your construction costs and your financing. So that will be packaged together when it's let when the solicitation goes out. In order for the solicitation to go out, though, we do need the design to be at least 90% when we start. Of course, by the time they submit, we want it at 100% so that they have all full plans, and then they're really bidding on the same thing. So we're hoping that decreases the variation in the types of proposals we'll get, because they know exactly what it is that they're supposed to be building, because the designs and the details are there. So that's the target again for the design and the solicitation for the next phase. Before we get to that point, though, we're aiming to try to get the construction management piece on board. They need to be in place before we get to that stage. So that's something that has to take place between now and the end of the year.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you to all the panel here, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Brown, do you have any questions or comments for the panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hopefully I don't have less time because it's going to get warmer, but you know, it's been a long time since I've looked at the budget for DOE, and I'm reminded the magnitude and the size of DOE, which is good, and maybe in some areas not so good, because you have such a huge operation to oversee. And as the chairman was mentioning, the fact that you have a decrease in enrollment, do you know why that is the case? Do you think that's also because of the charter schools, or? Right. Because I mean, as we mentioned when we had the budget hearing a few weeks ago of the charter schools, I like keeping people on their toes. And I'm going to ask you, what is the current amount per child that it costs at DOE now per child? How do you quantify that with your overall expenditures? What is the average cost now per child?
I'd have to go back. I think the last time I looked at it, it was in the 6,000 to 7,000 range.
It would be good to know. I mean, just in comparison, because I think as time goes on, certainly as parents have that option available, and many years ago when we actually did the legislation that created the charter schools was to open up that opportunity. And certainly in your leadership, you've put things a little more even-keel than how DOE used to be. I mean, DOE directors were revolving doors. Yeah. They lasted a year or two. They were very lucky. And how many years has it been now? Or 8, 9 years?
You can see right here.
Has it been about hairs. 8 or 9 years now?
It's 9 years.
9 years now that you've been at DOE. But what do you attribute that to? Because that's, I mean, you know, if the expectation is the budget for DOE continues to go up and the, you know, enrollment goes down, it does, you know, it's hard to convince your message to the public that, you know, you're deserving of continued larger appropriations.
Well, we certainly have observed the same, right? I think for us, when you see it for the first year, you say, okay, let's see if we can understand what's going on the first year or two, when we started to track that. And then, of course, we're now probably 4 or 5 years into this trend. We're down. We're certainly not going back up, but we might be stabilizing at a lower level. So it doesn't help. Well, first of all, like I said, when we could attribute it to the charters, that was okay because we kind of knew that this was, you know, this is a reason, and so that made sense. If you're opening up an elementary school and we lose elementary students and they end up in the charters, then of course that's explainable. And so overall the population doesn't change, but where they are, where they're at, you know, within DOE or in the charter or in private, that may differ. So the first couple of years, they coincided with the opening of the the charter schools plus the opening of CIFA, which is a middle school. And so we said, okay, you know, it looks like that's kind of the driving force because the numbers were close. And then we had another year where it went down again. No new charters opened. But it was happening in high school, and so it was hard to kind of figure that out. I mean, even when I say it, it coincided with this issue where 200 or more diplomas were given out, and we were hearing people, seniors withdrawing from school and graduating, only to find out that it was a scam that was being done. That, again, we're saying is that must be a one-time thing. So that was how we kind of approached the first few years. Now, we hope to get a better look. I mean, COVID-19 didn't help us. Yeah, so right now, I've had the planners who are helping us with facilities planning take a look at the demographics, not just on a year-to-year basis, but longer-term trends and compare it to what they're seeing elsewhere. So in the preliminary enrollment projections, there does look like there either be a steady decline or flat, projection of enrollment, which certainly, when it translates into facilities planning, means that you're not necessarily going to need to add to the square footage of your facilities because you're not anticipating that any unless something happens, any sudden increase. A lot of that, of what we're discussing, is attributable to the demographics, not just here, but nationally, in terms of the number of children that are born that now are going through the school system being less than, there might have been a few years ago. So with that said, we definitely know that'll factor into our facilities plans that, again, that plan is supposed to be completed by the end of the year. But that is one of the drivers of that plan. How much do you think the enrollment is going to increase or decrease? And I told them, make sure you have your ducks in order in terms of the research, because once you determine the demographic projections, that determines how much school space you need, and that'll have an impact on our budgetary discussions and our investment in facilities and so forth. So I do want to share that. I mean, there is at least it's a projection. It's not, it's to be proven true or false, but given everything that we know about the demographics, the military situation was also taken into consideration. Sure. Also, the Compactor Free Association and its potential impact. So they've got a range, of potential outcomes, but it doesn't point upward. It points either flat to declining. So that definitely is a policy issue that needs to be addressed. One of the other, so that's on the need side. On the spending side, that's, the question is, why is the spending going up? That's something we do have to look more closely at, and I know the board will do it. I know Dr. Okada was she just joined our board, and she was looking closely at the numbers. One of the biggest components of our budget happens to be the capital outlay. And as you know, if you don't have borrowing authority or the government's limited, you're looking for creative ways to try to catch up with your facility needs. Even as your enrollment declines, the facilities don't necessarily get any better. And so that number has been big, and we've been just tracking that. We're hoping that the investment that we're able to make now with the ARP in those facilities will now kind of take them off the books for several years to come. So we're really focused on the operations and what happens in the classroom, and then taking a look at what our needs are in the classroom. We'll look at what those costs are. But Joe can tell you that with the money that's coming in, technology should not be an issue, because we have the resources now to purchase the laptops and iPads and tablets and everything that we've been wanting to do across the school system. That won't be an issue. We've been able to invest in instructional resources and so forth. So I think on that side, we'll see the benefits. It'll all come down to the personnel. I think that's, you're talking about 80% of our budget is in personnel, and that's a bigger, harder discussion that we do have to have with the board in terms of, as we look ahead to the next budgets. We do, we do talk about cross-leveling and maximizing the classrooms all the time. And so, that'll be a continued discussion, especially if we think these trends are continuing and are not simply going to flatten or reverse, in the near future.
Well, and it's just because, we don't know where things are going to be a year or two from now. Fortunately, yes. Thank you, Uncle Sam. I mean, it's almost undreamed of the benefits now we're receiving as a result of the federal funds to get these additional computers and equipment and things that you would only desire. I'm sure in a few years when you have to replace them, there's going to be the challenge. But that's a concern, and certainly looking at your budget in the big picture, and I'm sure our chairman and committee members are looking at that. It's just how do we continue to keep the funding levels where we can? I mean, I see your board, Mr. Chairman, your board requests are really high. Collectively, what's approved by the board here and what actually is being authorized and even what the governor's recommending for your annual budget. I know it always comes down to cash and whether or not you meet payroll every 2 weeks. I mean, we can want, but you know, is the revenue and the cash there to be able to pay for it? And it's just also because, you know, looking at the budgets of other agencies of Governor Guam, that just a few, you know, $100,000 could profoundly make a tremendous difference in their operations, and they provide a critical public service as well. So that's what I'm looking at. I mean, I think we all realize education is very important, but you know, even you mentioned with regards to you know, maintenance of existing facilities and then potential construction of new facilities. I know there's a lot of attention placed on Simon Sanchez. I remember when that school was built in the early 70s. But there are schools on Guam that are far older. I know I went to one of those elementary schools, and they have not had any major refurbishment. And I don't know, looking in the next few years, if there's a need to rebuild some of those much older facilities, and how are we going to address the revenue for it, and how does that address, you know, how do we address that with our debt ceiling, with the desire to build a new hospital, build a new prison, and the list goes on, because we're only one government. So I don't know why I think about those things, but I do think about them, because I'm concerned in some areas there may be other critical needs in the next few years we're not able to address because we are maximizing our ability to borrow. And we're getting really happy about doing it because, you know, the money's here right now, but I don't know in the next few years, next 5 to 10 years, where we're going to be.
Very, very good points that you bring up. And one of the things that the board has been doing is we're reviewing our strategic plan. And part of this process is to kind of, what is that vision? What is that going to look like in the next 4 or 5 years? Way beyond, you know, what the resources we're getting from the federal government. And so it's creative ideas that we've had discussion with the good chair, where, you know, the textbook fund, that has always been a major issue for us. And so by doing that and putting it kind of like a sinking fund in 5 years, when we have to recycle out, we have that money readily available. And so it's thinking along those lines, you know, towards the future. And some of the things that we're also looking at in terms of the changes in our community and our society, there's a lot of housing developments going up in the northern and central parts. And so it's moving the population into some of the areas, and soon enough, you're going to have overcrowding. And then, you know, with the anticipation, what do we peg growth at? You know, looking at the military buildup, the potential of other people coming into the island. Right now, our, like you said, the enrollment is declining. It may shoot up in the next couple of months or years based on the folks that may be moving onto the island. Oftentimes in social media, you see people selling their stuff saying we're relocating, you know. So because of everything that's going on globally, I think, you know, we as a Department of Education, that's why the strategic plan is the perfect time for us to kind of look at it, dust it off, see what we can do to look towards the future. And then the other things that we're looking at too, and we're asking the superintendent, is maintenance, you know, for our facilities. Once we get these facilities up to at least, you know, where they need to be because of the deferred maintenance costs, that we have maintenance costs built into that, so that, you know, we can continually keep them up to a certain level. So obviously we understand the, you know, the government, the resources, but we're mandated, and the 14 points is another thing that Senator Talina Nelson asked us to look at. You know, are these things still relevant to some of the things that we're doing here? That's one of the reasons why the astronomical number that we're putting in there. But realistically, we know that, you know, when you have federal partners giving us the resources like this, and to the consolidated grant and all these different things, it helps us to meet our mission, you know. And so I just want to reassure the legislature and our community that our board is actively working with the superintendent to ensure that we have a plan and process. So when our time is done on the board or whatever, there's going to be a continuation of the good work that's being done at the Department of Education.
I think, Senator, also, if I could add to that, I mean, there are some things unique, and, you know, because you've been in different agencies, and some autonomous, some not autonomous. So there are certain things that are unique to the DOE that contribute to some of the things that you see. So, I mean, for instance, there is a statutory provision that requires us to go to our schools, have the PTO meetings to come up with the budget, and it starts really at the ground level before it gets to the board. Yeah, by the time you go to the board, I mean, who's going to say that, you know, Tan Maria's request for this should be included. I mean, that's what the intent is, right? Get the grassroots, your stakeholders at the front lines to tell you what you need, build that up. And then we send it right to, in addition to that, you have the 14 points. And the 14 points is, they seem like, good things you can agree on, but the trigger is that if you don't meet any of that, you get sued. And especially if you don't even ask for it, you have the potential to be, to be sued to enforce the 14 points. So there are a lot of interesting factors that result.
Must have been an attorney that developed that legislation.
Right.
What are the odds?
Right, because it's not the 14 points is the real issue. It's the matter that it's the legal side that if you don't do what you're supposed to do, it says here's who can sue you and to make you do that. So I think just in that spirit, of course, the budget requests they come right to the legislature for you to sort out, given that you have everything else, all the other agencies. But I do want to say that from the standpoint of looking forward, what the pandemic has done, what we've been through this last 18 months, should raise a lot of questions regarding how we can move forward. So all this new technology that we have, hopefully the investments in the facilities to take some of these facility issues just off the table so that we're no longer complaining about the facility but focusing on teaching and learning. Knowing the challenges in the teaching profession, we're not going to solve the shortage overnight. The question is, should we be doing what we're doing the same way we've been doing it all these years, or what kind of changes do these resources enable now? Because we taught online, and we're looking at now, how do we look at online learning as a way to address some of these issues that we had in the past of not having enough teachers to be able to offer these types of classes? How do we use the technology for credit recovery for students who've fallen behind, but they just may not be appropriate for the classes that are being offered? So there are lots of possibilities, and I think you're right. It's up to us, the board, and to determine whether we're going to just continue to do things the same way, or can we make changes knowing that this funding won't be available forever, and who knows what the revenue situation will look like for the rest of the government. So this is kind of a pivotal time coming out of this pandemic to think about, okay, do we need to do things the same way we just distance learned, distance worked? We're going to have automated time tracking. I mean, there's different ways to account for the operational effectiveness of the agency. So it's a big task. So you're right to point it out.
With the upcoming school year now, you anticipate to have your students back in the classroom, and I don't know the main reason. I don't know if it's just the size and magnitude of DOE that you were not able to move sooner, and then maybe families or parents were not as excited of allowing their children to go to school right away as a result of the pandemic. But I noticed the private schools since January were able to get their schools operational and be able to get things in place that they needed so that there was a protocol and safety for the students in the classroom. And I want to know why. Is it the size and magnitude of DOE that slowed that process down? What was the main reason that because I've done both. I learned the Google Classroom last year, and in class, but there's nothing that beats in-class learning, being in there with direct instruction with your teacher and being there with your fellow classmates learning in that environment.
Yeah, and I think we all have our different constituencies when it comes to the different school systems and so forth. I do think that one of the hardest transitions, of course, for everybody was moving from in-class instruction to distance learning. I think we all were willing, and if we could, and I think everyone made the adjustment to do that. And then at the end of the day, I think people all still realize, that still doesn't beat in-class instruction. We think online learning is great for certain things, but not for everybody, not for every teacher. So we are back to let's get back to work. But at the time, first of all, remember, we were under the governor's order to shut down, and we did, and tried to make the adjustments. And then going into the school year, we were ready to open up on a cohort basis. I mean, we had 3 models of learning that we were willing to support because unlike many schools, we knew that students didn't have technology but weren't going to be able or wanting to go to school that we had to reach. So we tried to do 3 models of learning, and then we got to the point where face-to-face was not allowed for that semester. And then, of course, in January, we reopened. The private schools, I think, had a lot of incentive to reopen. I mean, I think part of it is because they rely on tuition. And I know a lot of parents that I talk to say, I don't want to pay tuition if they're just going to get what everyone else is getting online, like Google, like you said, Google Classroom. I mean, it's not the same as in-person learning. So I think there was a real motivation. If I were a private school administrator, let's find a way to get them in. And if you have smaller classrooms and smaller class sizes, it enables you to comply with the safety requirements. Whereas, we're talking 25 to 30 students in a classroom, it makes it difficult to meet the 3 foot, much less the 6 feet requirements. But if you're at 22 or below, you could find a way to do that. So, Dodea was probably the best example of let's go and open, and they opened first. 90% or more of their parents were wanting to open because pretty much you can't really complete your mission as an employee on base if you've got to stay home with your kids. We were working over the summer with our stakeholders, and at the end of the day, 70% of them did not feel comfortable going back to school at the time. I mean, of course, this is before vaccinations and everything. So we did a lot of outreach just to check and see what the pulse of our stakeholders were. 70% did not want to return, so we wanted to find a way to deal with the 30% who did come back in January and try to support the rest. Once the vaccinations became available for younger people, once we knew that the safety parameters were going to ease up and we were going to be able to have these safety measures be brought in to be put into the schools, with the HEPA filters, with all these other things, we felt comfortable at the end of last semester saying, okay, no more hard copy. We're going to go back to school. We still allowed for online because at the time we made the decision, we weren't this far along. But right now, we really could take care of 100% students returning to the classroom now that we've gotten this far. So, for us, it's different with the size and scale of our organization. But I think we worked well with the private schools to see what they were doing. I mean, Joe toured St. Anthony, I think, to kind of get a handle on what are you guys doing that's working and what's not working. And I think we found a lot of commonality that even if you could make it work, there's still a lot of things that were challenging to teachers that we took into consideration in our plans as well, because we heard the same thing on our end. We can't do both. It's hard to teach in class and online at the same time. We've got to find a way to come back to in-person learning if possible, and I think we're there. So I also think we're ahead of many other jurisdictions. I mean, there are some jurisdictions that have been open for forever. I mean, they haven't closed, but for others, with regard to the vaccinations that we're seeing, we were, I think, among the first to have our teachers and school staff vaccinated because we asked the governor, put them at the front of the line because we're trying to reopen schools so that parents can go back to work if they're needed. So I think we've been as aggressive as we can compare to other jurisdictions. And now we're at a point where I think we can get to that full reopening, albeit in a COVID environment with all the safety protocols that are going to be required. But I think it's important that the parents and students have faith in what we're doing. So we really needed to have that opportunity to test the protocols. We have positive cases in the schools, so we needed to be able to make sure we know how to communicate, how to address those, work with public health, and ensure that the other parents and students felt confident that they could return safely and that we had their safety in mind. So it was a longer process, but as very well, there's a lot of a broader constituency to hear from and to work with to make things happen, along those lines.
My last question, I'm sure there's a lot because you got the biggest budget, but I won't belabor it this afternoon. But the director of DPW wasn't sure, and you do have children in summer school now?
Yes.
That are being bused?
Yes.
Who's paying for the busing? Normally in summer school, DOE would cover that cost, and that would not be burdened by DPW. Who is paying that this summer?
Oh, so the governor actually, in our discussions, should be covering those costs. So that's something we'll follow up on. I think so. As I mentioned, they received $12.5 million in CARES funding and $33 million in the ESF2 funding. So as part of our discussions, they were always committed to doing that. I think it just hasn't happened yet. So we'll follow up to see, how to make sure DPW is whole.
Yeah, and it's just normally because for DPW, for bus stops, and they're challenged. I mean, just trying to maintain the bus
Right.
system. I mean, they have nowhere near the resources that we provide and fund DOE with. And normally
Right.
the funds that they receive from summer school go into their account, and that's what they use to get other critical needs for their operations for bus stops that normally is not appropriated on an annual
Yeah.
basis. So
They should get, so they
for
should
the
be
bus
receiving
drivers,
that.
it's important.
Yeah, you're right.
That does matter, and so I want to make sure that those guys at least get that support.
We'll follow up on that, but that is our understanding because, we were always asked, how can we support you? Well, we said it gets complicated when you're taking your funds to support us, and we have the funds to do summer school and do all these other things. So it'd probably be best for you to just fund DPW to cover transportation. So we'll circle back because he probably has not seen that money
Yeah.
come
No,
in.
and
So
I mean, and if we know that they're going to get,
Yeah.
they know they're going to get compensated, I think they'll feel a little more comfort.
Yes.
Because that concern was raised from, it's not from the top. I mean, like I
Right.
said, the director didn't know or couldn't answer the question with regards to that specific issue. But I know for the bus division there, that funding is important because that's their resource that they look for the things that they need for bus stops. And, if you look at the investment we made, I mean, the substations and, the conditions and challenges bus operations has. So, anything they get back that's reinvested back in them, that helps keep them going.
So we'll check in on that. It is again supposed to be funded out of the governor's educational federal funding pot, and that's been our discussion. We'll make sure that there's, that's
Yeah, I just don't want to see
follows
that amount
through.
get lost, because I do know for summer with the federal funding, you're able to, even
Yeah.
in the private schools, to provide summer
And-
school.
and
I know, Joe, you
DPW
were commenting, I hope everybody's turning in their required documentation to be able to receive, the federal funding for the summer school program.
And DPW is critical for next year's, for opening school. So yeah, we want them happy and ready to roll. So
All right, I
yeah,
appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you if
Follow
you
up.
follow up on your end. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to ask questions. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. That being that, we concluded with all my colleagues asking questions, the committee will conclude this budget hearing. The committee will continue to receive testimony, and please address your written testimony to the Committee on General Government Operation, Appropriation, and Housing, and submit it via email to Senator Joe S. Agustin@gmail.com, or to my office located at Rand Care Building, 2nd floor, Suite 3, 761 South Marine Corps Drive, Tamuning, Guam. Sijus Masi, to the Department of Education, Mr. Chairman, Superintendent, and your folks, your staff, for your attendance today and participation in today's hearing. And for those at home, thank you for watching. This budget hearing on Bill 55-36 COR relative to the Department of Education is now adjourned. It is 4:03. Please be safe and take care.